This recording is a little bit of documentation on the exploration and learning that I've gone through this year. I was grateful to have learned a ton of new things from a bunch of great people, and I wanted this presentation to serve as a capstone project for those learnings. This presentation is rooted in the ecological dynamics framework, which is one of the coolest things that I learned this year. And it'll start off by giving a little bit of background on the EcoD framework and then work its way to things that are more abstract, some questions and potential doors that you can go knocking on to learn more and hopefully open up the realm of exploration for yourself as well. Most of this presentation is going to be looking at things such as sport through the lens of mainly baseball, but it's applicable to all things throughout life. So to start, some principles of ecological dynamics, or EcoD. I think the best way for me to show you this is to show you a photo of the classic old game paper toss. Shout out Garrett Baker for this example. But let's watch the video and we can talk about how this kind of underpins the whole idea of EcoD. So as you can see, if anybody's played the game before, it's relatively intuitive how quickly people pick it up. You have to chuck a crumpled up paper ball into a waste bin and be able to adjust it to how the fan is blowing. And so people, when they start playing the game after a few tries, will quickly catch up and realize, oh, if the wind's blowing stronger, I need to aim a little bit more into the wind so the wind can blow it back. But this underpinning principle is that success is achieved by adjusting your actions to the environment. The paper toss exists within a system, and the most perfect toss in isolation, if you make the perfect straight toss and the wind's blowing, it might not guarantee a basket. A successful one is one that functionally adapts to the environment around it, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about of how ecological dynamics shape sport. So the two forefathers of ecological dynamics and where the name actually comes from, the first part comes from, on the left, J.J. Gibson, and on the right, the second part, Nikolai Bernstein. So the left side with Gibson, his role, he was deep into ecological psychology, which was the role that information plays in essentially how we view the world. And Bernstein dealt more with action and how we self-organize to the different information. So, as you might think, it's kind of a match made in heaven. So with this perception and action, the way that we view the world, whether it's through our eyes or through the haptic system or auditory system, can guide different movement, or it's coupled to your action. And Bernstein talked about how that these actions are not necessarily actions in isolation, but they have a goal. If you've seen the famous photo of the blacksmith hitting the anvil, there's different paths that the blacksmith can take with his hammer to hit the anvil or hit his specified goal. But the overarching principle is that these movements should be functional. And so when you can tie this perception and action together, every time that you move or pick up new information, it should then shape your action. And existing right at the center of those is an affordance. And an affordance is the property of an object that defines its possible uses. When you go up to a door and the door has something that's a handle, it usually signifies that it's a pull door. When you go to a chair and it has a flat horizontal surface, it's one that can be sit upon. And so that is where the perception of seeing what this object could potentially afford, and then your action capabilities, I know how to sit, I know how to pull a door, those things get coupled together as you go throughout the environment. So how can we kind of apply this to sports and specifically baseball? So my thinking's been shaped in many ways by Garrett Baker and Nick Askew in this way. And Garrett Baker talks about his idea of out-getter eyes. So how information can be picked up in the environment and then used to get a guy out. And this is used in a pitching scenario. So to answer the question below, how am I going to pitch this guy? I need to be able to understand the environment, and I also need to understand my capability. So if you look at these two photos, in the photo on the left, you see Howie from Benchwarmer stepping up to the plate with a sword. He looks nervous. Guys aren't really sure what's going on. And so you can see, okay, maybe he's not super comfortable on the plate. And due to that uncomfortable nature, I have a high fastball that I can use that can get him up and in and brush him back off the plate, one that he might not be able to swing at. Conversely, in the other image, you got Ham up there, and he looks like he's ready to smash a homer over the scoreboard. And you would say, "Oh man, this guy's pretty confident. He's looking good in the box. Maybe I'm going to pitch him slightly differently." And so this is kind of how the role of the information of the batter is shaping how the pitcher is going to use his different pitches to try to get that batter out. Now I quickly want to go into the aspect of skill, and so how a skill fits within this framework. And we're going to start by watching another video again. Pedro Serrano from Major League. As you all know, that he really struggles to hit a curveball, but absolutely mashes fastballs, and we're going to talk about why that might be.
Digging in, down a strike. Jackson gets his sign and comes set. Checks Dorn at first. Here's the pitch, a curveball, swung on and missed. Strike two, and Serrano wasn't even close.
So you see there, Serrano misses by a ton on the curveball, but we know that he can absolutely mash fastballs, and so why might that be? So his swing is a fastball swing, one that in batting practice, there's fireworks all over the place, but skills are not necessarily an isolated activity. Skills are a function of the performer-environment relationship. This pitcher is constantly opposing the batter and trying to get him out and making adjustments in his pitches. And a batter who is skillful should be able to adjust to that environment no matter where it is. That bridges into the whole sort of idea of skill acquisition versus skill adaptation. And so on the left side, we have a box score from the Angels, Shohei Ohtani going off, 4 for 5 at the plate, having a stellar day. And then this is the next day. You can see at the bottom, relatively similar time. These were two back-to-back days. Ohtani went 0 for 4. And so you say, okay, well, the first day, Ohtani crushed it. You think, oh, he's got the game of baseball figured out. But things change. Even though that many things might be the same, some things are different here. You can see that, okay, the wind is blowing a little bit more in the game on the left, and then the weather's slightly different. There's all these things that kind of change throughout the time, and you can't look at the left. Everybody knows that baseball, okay, had a great game. That doesn't mean that he's always going to have a great game or that he has it solved. But the goal and skill is that you need to attempt to build an increasingly functional relationship between your environment when you're the performer. So Shohei Ohtani, over time, you hope that he exists in an increasingly functional relationship with that environment. Okay, he can go to Oriole Park, he can go to different spots across the country playing different games, and in theory, he should be able to create functional solutions across all of those changing environments. That's adaptation rather than an acquisition where, oh, he was successful, it's unlocked, he's always going to be successful now. That's not necessarily the case in sport. Now I want to talk about two important concepts that underpin this whole aspect, which are attunement and calibration. And so again, we're gonna start with some videos. On the left, Joe Pesci from Home Alone. You can see how he is lacking in attunement in this area. Now on the right, we're going to talk about some calibration with Jim Carrey.
I'll have you know I have the reflexes of a cat and the speed of a mongoose. Throw it. I dare ya. Don't just stand there. Throw me a spear.
So obviously in those clips, things are exaggerated, but this is a great example in my mind of attunement versus calibration. Attunement is picking up the right info, and calibrating is adjusting an appropriate functional response to that information. And so as you can see, it's not enough to notice the correct information. You also have to be able to correspond with it. In the Home Alone example, the criminal did not pick up the right information. The right information was that the doorknob was glowing and that if he touched it, it was going to burn his hand. He was not attuned to the information that would keep him safe and allow him to enter the house safely. On the right, obviously, Jim Carrey can see the spear and he says, "Throw me a spear." He's looking at it, but he's unable to calibrate his body to be able to catch the spear, and it winds up hitting him. So these two things need to exist in tandem. You need to focus on the right info at the right time to make sure that you organize the action response to solve the problem at hand. And so the question then becomes in baseball is, are athletes lacking attunement or calibration? If you think about the hitting side, are our athletes struggling with pitch recognition or swing adjustment? Like many high school players out there will come into the dugout and say, "Oh, this pitcher's not good. His curveball just spins," even though they had just struck out on that pitch. Are they being able to recognize the pitch, but not calibrate it, or are they not being able to recognize the pitch itself? I also want to show another example here of what beautiful connection of attunement and calibration looks like from Dustin Pedroia.
There goes Pedroia. Ortiz takes the throw to second base. Safe. And taken off for third is Pedroia. He'll get there. Nobody covered the bag. The shift was on. Heads up.
So obviously great play, great creative play by Pedroia, but he is attuned to the fact that the shift is on and that there's nobody covering third base. And he also has the capabilities and is able to organize a response to that information to be able to actually take that bag. Some players might recognize the base was open, but be unable to take it, or some people might be able to take it, but not realize that it was open. He mingles these together really well to make an amazing play. So now we're going to talk about the environment. We briefly referenced it about having a functional relationship with it. And now I want to kind of talk about how the environment shapes some of the action that our performers engage in. So here, obviously kind of ridiculous photo of a tree planted right in front of the pitcher's mound, but the environment will shape the information, which helps shape the action. So in this ridiculous example, if a pitcher's behind that tree, they in theory can use that tree to be able to get a batter out, or it's going to shape how they pitch. Maybe they might not be able to come from a certain arm slot anymore because the tree's in the way. And so even this is a extreme example, there are always instances of information in the environment that the athlete can interact with, and it's our job to start to understand, okay, how is this shaping his movement? And so I want to go into a really cool little graphic that Duarte Arugio had mentioned at the Emergent Sport Movement Skill Conference, which deals with context. So you can see obviously the top, it looks like ABC, but the bottom you see 12, 13, 14. And the B and 13 look exactly the same. But context shapes the information that gives it. And so when you're in the game and when you're taking care of your practices, the environment info should be representative. You don't want a player to think that, oh, I'm dealing with a B here, but in the game it's actually a 13. So making sure that context between practice and the game is there is incredibly important. And this is something that Stu McMillan talked about in his starling versus murmuring analogy. A murmuring is one of those beautiful shapes that birds create in air as they're migrating and moving around, but they're made up of individual starlings. And you can't understand a murmuring just by looking at a starling. And in theory, you can't understand the starling just by looking at the murmuring, that a system is not equal to one of its parts, that each individual part shapes the whole, but we need to be able to understand not only the part itself, but how it relates to the rest of the system. Then this kind of blends into a little bit of practice, not necessarily psychology, but practice design, is that variability is everywhere, that these games that we play, especially baseball, are systems and they're not static. people are competing against you, things change. You can see in the images, ballparks are crazy different. There's always things that are going to be slightly different, even if the underlying game or sport is the same. And so, like we talked about in the Otani example, is how can we work with our athletes to try to find ways for them to create this notion of dynamic stability where they can achieve the outcomes that we want them to achieve under different changing conditions. And in practice, we can adjust many of the different things that will be there during the game, such as intentions, actions, information, interactions, to be able to give them a large bank of knowledge and being able to solve those problems and staying in a functional relationship no matter how much things change. So now that we talked about the environment, we want to talk about the performer within the environment. I'm going to talk about the athlete. So as a basic setup, this is the constraints model. And so this kind of talks about how the organism, task, and environment exist together, and that, as we talked about before, the perception and action guides towards the movement goal. Sean and Tyler did some great work talking about reconceptualizing sport as a problem-solving activity, kind of bridging off Verkhoshansky's idea of using different movements to solve problems that exist on the field. And so how this works in the game is say, oh, you know, I'm a base runner and this guy has a great pickoff move, so I'm going to have to slightly adjust my lead a little bit, but I still want to steal a base, so how am I going to be able to adjust that? These are all different problems that the athlete has to create different movements to try to solve. And as Sean has talked about, no two problems are the same, and so in theory, an athlete should have many solutions. There shouldn't just be one master key that they apply to all scenarios, but they should have an abundance of solutions to be able to solve many of these problems that will pop up in the activity. So now is kind of the point in the presentation where we're starting to kind of diverge into things that are a little bit more abstract, and building off of that that notion of how many solutions does an athlete have and what do those solutions potentially look like. I want to dive in a little bit into outliers. So obviously Tyler Rogers here is a massive outlier, just the way that he throws from his different slot. He doesn't throw very hard, but it goes into how does a player's authenticity shape their movement. You know, different outliers usually move in different ways than other people. And as Stu McMillan talks about is, well, why does he do that? And potentially why might it be functional, and how can we use it? So if you look at guys such as Jose Altuve, his run value outperforms his expected run value every single year. And so at that point, you start to think, okay, well, maybe he's doing something that we don't fully understand right now that's causing him to be very successful. And so how do we potentially allow these athletes the authenticity to have their movement in the way that they see fit and be able to still functionally solve problems? It might not look how one might expect, but they'll be able to achieve functional solutions in the environment, which in theory is the most important thing. Now I want to go into an interesting story that I believe gives good context to that whole notion of outliers and what you can see in different authenticity. This is one of my favorite stories that I heard growing up as a kid watching the show Gold Rush, is that a few gold miners in the present age have actually been going back to the tail piles or the scrap piles of miners back from the gold rush age and putting those scraps through their sluice boxes again and actually finding a ton of gold. And the reason this is that back in the gold rush days is they didn't have the technology to be able to pick up some more of the fine pieces of gold or gold that didn't sink all the way down to the bottom in the sluice box, but modern technology has gotten better. And so those people at the time thought, this is scrap, there's no gold in here. But we know that over time, things get better and our analysis becomes better. This bridges into an idea by one of my favorite authors, Nassim Taleb, is that absence of evidence does not equal evidence of absence. Just because that those gold rush miners could not find any evidence of gold does not mean that there actually is no gold there. That these modern prospectors have come and been able to find gold. And so that begs the question in sports of, what does our scrap pile look like? What are things that we potentially at the time couldn't fully quantify or understand or maybe know was there that we scrapped away, that one day somebody might say, oh man, there's actually still some value here. So this is where I want to bridge into a little bit how we analyze the sport, how we analyze success, how we analyze development. And so to start, I want to go through a great video. Shout out Matt Caraccio and Adam Omashinsky for sharing this with me. I think it gives a really great example of how we can have respect for the system and things that we maybe might not be seeing. So I want to play this video one more time. I want you to look at the top right of the screen on the first view. You can see that St. Brown's circle lights up green, although Justin Fields throws it to DJ Moore. And so although St. Brown's lights up green, that's essentially the prime vision analytics saying that St. Brown is the best choice. He's the most open. He is the most separation. But Fields didn't throw it there, but he still scored a touchdown. And so in theory, he would be given a poor decision score on this play, but should he be given a poor decision score? Maybe instead of saying, oh, he didn't throw it to the receiver who is the most open, the questions we should maybe be asking are, why didn't Fields throw it to St. Brown? Or on the corollary for baseball or for other sports is, why are our players maybe not meeting their metrics? And it's, how can we have respect for the system? If you looked in the second part of the clip, and I'll play it again, the reason that Fields didn't potentially throw it to St. Brown was that there was a linebacker that sort of creeped in his line of sight, and Fields was also looking left. And so Fields might have thought, oh, that linebacker is in the way. I can't throw that to St. Brown, but I can see DJ Moore is open. And so it was a functional solution, but it wasn't necessarily one that the analytics picked up. So how can we potentially have more respect for the system instead of docking Fields points for potentially making the quote unquote wrong throw? How can we more use it in a judgment-free way, so to speak, to be able to understand maybe why he made that decision and how we can start to understand that better in the future? So this goes to an idea that Matt Caraccio also talked about with me of kind of analyzing like a forensic accountant. A forensic accountant is not necessarily trying to shape the numbers within the books. They're just trying to get an understanding for the system, and not only understanding it from what's there, but also what's not there, what might be missing. This is something that Stu McMillan and Carl Woods had talked about, where that music is the space between the notes. And so the corollary of that is that good analysis understands the notes, but great analysis understands the spaces. This kind of goes into a bit of a math area with nodes and edges, where nodes are essentially actions that happen or their states of being, but life and different things happen at the edges. They happen at the links. And so how can we start to understand the gaps between different states, the gaps between how an athlete got from one place to another? In a basic life example, if you look at a node, say one node is graduating high school and one node is graduating college, and you think, oh, okay, well, there's progress there, but there's so much that has gone on in between that time that deals with who the person is and how they've grown and what they've been through. That's really important information for us to understand that person as a whole. And so when looking at a system or an athlete's movement or solutions, we want to try to get a picture of not only just those finite states, but also maybe what led them to get to those states as well. And this is where I kind of want to talk about the idea of comparison to good and state of the art. It deals with the the nodes and edges that we just talked about in the previous slide. But sometimes when you think, oh, I have a goal in mind that I want this person to get here, or I want to be going in this direction, these things can potentially be deceptive. We have models in our minds of, oh, the number one player in the world does this. They swing in this way. They hip hinge in this way if they're pitching. But if your model is built on the best in the world and you always follow it to a T, you'll never get another number one in the world. You're essentially trying to raise all of the average together, but you truly miss out on some of those outliers and things that uh, do something novel and really create. At some point, you have to diverge. You have to kind of take that path that no one's gone before to potentially be in a place that no one else could even imagine. And so this is kind of an idea that's been shaped a lot in my mind by Ken Stanley and Joel Lehman, who wrote a wonderful book called Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned. And they have the photo on the right in their book where it talks about if this car was essentially guided by an objective function. So an objective function would be every move that it makes should lessen the distance between it and the finish line. So in this example, the car would start going north towards the finish line, each time increasing how close it was to the finish. And at a certain point, it would hit a wall and get stuck because once it gets into that little crevice when it's going towards the flag, any move that it would make to try to get out of there is actually going away from the flag, and that is not part of its programming, so it's stuck. And so the idea here is that to be successful, the car actually has to go further away from the flag first before it can get closer, but actually achieve it. And so this is kind of how the idea of constantly comparing yourself to good or where you think you should be can potentially be bad because we sometimes with ambitious goals and novel things don't really know what good looks like or what the steps we need to take to get there are. It's important sometimes to actually be able to do some things that are novel and diverge off the quote unquote path to be able to unlock some really new interesting things. And so with that in mind, I want to use that to kind of shape the presentation aspect now where we're going to go into talking about how we're going to develop our pitchers. How are we going to join with them and be able to see how they can get better? And this is not just for pitchers, this is also for all athletes, especially all the ones on the baseball field. So co-design, what is it? Really amazing idea that I'd heard from the emergence guys of how can we work with our athletes to design practices together? How many times have we seen an athlete that's struggling, decided what they're doing wrong, and then just slapped plans on them and told them, hey, if you follow this, you're going to get better? But at no point in that process have we actually really ever asked them what they're struggling with or what they're thinking that they need to get better. This should be a guiding process on the coach. It should be one that is a back and forth, is trying to seek to understand how this player plays the game. And for many of the times, the players actually know what they need to work on, and they sometimes have better ideas because they're in it. They're there, and they sometimes just need a guide or a resource to be able to help them put some of these ideas that they have into play. And so some of the underlying concepts that I find interesting with this co-design dynamic is, okay, how can we make this feel more like a game? Someone can design a plan, but once you start the plan, it's like, this doesn't really feel like a game. I'm not sure how effective this is. But that's where asking an athlete who actually is in the game, you can say, oh, well, does this feel like a game? What would you adjust to make this feel like a game? How can we decrease the complexity to help you succeed and be able to build some different skills? Asking the athlete questions and designing with them and seeing and perceiving affordances through his eyes is very important. And this kind of goes into that rigid planning process that I just briefly mentioned in the last slide. But how many things do we come numb to on the baseball field that are bad, but we've just always done them that way, so we always continue to do it? And I'm going to show an example here of one of the things that I definitely think we've become numb to. So on the left, obviously, you can see it's one of those classic PFP practices that I'm sure you see at every college baseball field across America come early spring. And it has become a choreographed dance. This is not something that is alive, so to speak. There's a great idea by the architect Christopher Alexander, which talks about alive patterns, ones that kind of draw you into life and are so alive that it almost feels that it is inherent and a part of nature. And we can see these PFPs and we look and we say, do they feel like part of a game, which in theory is nature in this point? And no, they seem more of a structured steps and dance that they're going to try to complete something that's more of a production rather than actually creating game-like scenarios for pitchers to solve. And the things that happen are that when the real game happens, oh, the runners are running down the line way faster than you thought. Oh, you sort of slipped when you fielded this ball, and you don't have as much time anymore, and you start to rush, and then you make a mistake. These things are rarely ever done in practice. If in practice you make a mistake or you trip, oh well, you just go to the back of the line and start again. There's no specifying relevant information of dealing with these fielding drills for pitchers that are actually going to exist in the game. So this is just one example, but how can we better recognize these dead patterns and find ways to inject some aliveness into them? And so to wrap up with the last few slides, I want to talk about reframing. Reframing how we view not only some development on the athlete side or how we understand an athlete, but also about some more not to say pie in the sky, but things that are, this is the part of the presentation that's kind of the most abstract, but I think is really useful and are things that have been very interesting to me so far this year. So the first one I want to talk about is kind of the paradox of attention and the importance of novelty or doing unplanned things. So on the left side, you obviously see the spotlight where a paradox of attention is lit up. But the question is, okay, we've lit up that area, but what is potentially being filtered out? And this is something that I think is really interesting, is that the human system can only take in so much information at once, and we have to tone out things around us. So right now I'm presenting across the screen. I'm focused on the screen, on the slides, but I've tuned out anything that's going on behind me. A spider could have dropped down behind me, and I wouldn't have noticed because it's not within my area of attention. And so the question becomes, what are the different things that are being filtered out? Okay, by focusing on, say, something in the hitting realm, such as increasing bat speed or exit velocity, what are the other aspects that potentially are filtered out that we're not seeing, and are they potentially important? Kind of an analogy from a game, from Sims. If your goal is to build the biggest house, you potentially miss out on other interesting things within the game. And not to say that building a house is bad, but it also just means that you can't do other things. And so trying to figure out and be cognizant of, if we focus on something, we have to lessen our focus on other things, making sure that we can sort of understand what are the most important things we want to focus on. And that bridges into this second picture, which is a picture actually of penicillin. And so if anybody has known the story of penicillin, Alexander Fleming discovered it completely by accident. And this is where you think, oh, well, we know what's good and what's important. We just need to follow this area. Sometimes the best discoveries and the most innovative things are not planned, and you don't really know how to get there. Fleming wasn't looking for penicillin. He was doing other experiments, happened to leave his petri dish out overnight, and then realized that there was a bacteria that was not allowing, I forget exactly what it was, but wasn't allowing this virus or this bad bacteria to spread. It was a mold that was essentially protecting an antimicrobial, so to speak. But this was completely unplanned. But the importance of this is that being able to create space to explore and do novel things is really important. You don't know what doing something novel might step to that will be actually very helpful in the game. And this is where, in the Fleming example, he created the space to be able to leave things around his lab and do something different that he didn't realize. He would never have potentially left his petri dish there unattended on purpose, but it just so happened that it created a really novel, great solution that has saved a ton of lives. And so, in practice, how can you balance doing things that you know are important with also creating room for novel things to find new solutions that maybe would not have come to mind if you were looking just straight ahead in that regular cone of attention? And the corollary to this aspect is the players that are involved. How do their unique upbringings and characteristics shape the way that they play and create their novelty and innovation? So obviously, when you watch the World Baseball Classic, it's one of the coolest things ever to be able to see that although they're playing the same game, all these different countries come up with so many different solutions to how they solve problems. And a lot of that, I believe, is shaped by their upbringing and culture. And this is an idea that Tom Parry, Andy Grahn, and Chris McCosker talked about, is that there are so many forces that shape an athlete's narrative and the way that they also move. Um, a lot of you see there's a very distinctive hitting style from the Asian players, especially the lefties that are kind of do the Ichiro Shohei, look like they're almost bailing out of the box, but still find a way to hit the outside pitch. And the question is why might that come to pass? And so, how do these different ways that the athletes view themselves and view their culture shape the way that they play? Because not everybody understands the game the way that I am. I have a unique way of looking at things, and to think that my way is the best way, in my opinion, is a naive way, especially where what might have worked for me is not necessarily going to work for somebody else, and I wouldn't want to lead them down that path of just perpetuating what worked for me. I would want them to solve and be able to figure out what works for them. You obviously see the Jeff McNeil photo on the right. His name is the Squirrel, and he gets the nickname the Squirrel obviously because he kind of embodies that playing style. And that's a question we could be asking our athletes of, such as what kind of music do you like? What animal embodies your playing style? And try to figure out what are their authentic selves and how do they view themselves in the context of sport and how might that kind of shape their playing? So Jeff McNeil being the squirrel's not somebody who hits towering homers. The squirrel is somebody that, finds a way to dink and dunk, kind of knock some hits in, be able to take the extra base and play scrappy. And it's no surprise that, I mean, he's won a batting title for that sort of play. And if he tried to be somebody that he wasn't, I don't think he would have nearly been as successful as he is. So, how are we kind of letting this diversity of interest and diversity of upbringings kind of be able to collect cool treasures and learn new novel things to solve solutions within the game? And so last, I want to talk about an idea that Annie Duke mentions that's called a pre-mortem. And so fast forward 5 years, and we find out our players got worse. What happened? I believe that's a really insightful question to be able to take a clear-eyed look at what are the things that we're doing, where are our weak points, what are our assumptions where things could potentially break down, and then we can start to kind of take a look at those areas. And then second, are athletes performing because of our coaching or in spite of it? Is there survivorship bias going on that these athletes are getting better just because that's what they're doing, or are we actually kind of finding ways for our players to actually get better? And these are two very convicting questions, and one that the answers are kind of difficult to look at, but are really important in getting a better view and understanding of what's potentially going on in our development and with our players. To wrap, I just wanted to say a big thank you for all the people who've shaped my thinking this year. One of the highlights of the year in learning was going to the Emergence Sport Movement Skill Conference, and I thank Tyler and Sean and everybody else at Emergence for setting that up. Hopefully, this presentation opened up some doorways for you to pursue some new ideas and be able to integrate it into your own authentic selves. And hopefully, this will, you know, kind of inspire some new thoughts in your minds to be able to help your athletes be able to perform better on the field and to be able to exist in a more functional relationship with them. Thanks so much for watching.